Chapter 15, Another History Lesson. Toward the end of May, as he had every single Friday morning since the beginning of the school year, Mr. Jupiter said, "Let's begin by reviewing some American history. I trust everyone read last night's assignment." As always, Ashley A. bit her lip. Ashley Z. tapped his pencil. Calvin quickly looked at Stanford. "Stop!" cried Stanford, holding up his hand like a traffic cop. "I didn't read it, okay? I was busy studying something else, so I didn't read it. Geez." Mr. Jupiter sighed. "Didn't anyone read their American history lesson last night?" Lenny's hand shot up in the air. "I did." "You did?" said Mr. Jupiter. He waited for the punchline. It never came. Instead, Lenny said, "It takes me most of the school year, but I've read the whole book. And you know what? History isn't half that bad." "It isn't?" said Calvin. "Actually, it's kind of exciting," continued Lenny. Mr. Jupiter nodded. "Why don't you tell us what you learned, Leonard?" "Well," said Lenny, "it all begins when the British put tax on stamps. Boy, this made Americans so mad they wanted to lick them. So they were still steaming about the stamp tax when the British took away Americans' favorite drink. 'Give us liber-tea or give us death,' cried the Americans. Even dogs took to the street in protest, an event we now call the Boston Flea Party." They're referring to the Boston Tea Party, when they threw all the tea over the ship, the harbor, into the harbor from the ships. "Wait a second, Leonard," interrupted Mr. Jupiter, but Lenny was on a historic roll. "So the leaders of the American colonies, those guys in wigs, three-cornered hats, decided to declare themselves free from England and George III's cruel rule." "Very accurate," complimented Mr. Jupiter. "Go on," urged Calvin, leaning forward. "What happened next?" "England didn't want the colonies to be free, so there was a war." Bruce rubbed his hands together with glee. "I love war stories." "Get this," confided Lenny. "The whole American Revolution is a war story." "Who knew?" said Bruce. "It's all right here," said Mr. Jupiter, tapping the history text. The fifth graders ignored him. "Tell the rest," pleaded Calvin. "So the wigged guys said 'rats' to the British and called up George Washington at his house, Mount Vernon, and asked him to lead the American army." "Mount Vernon," corrected Mr. Jupiter. Lenny was too absorbed in his story to hear. George Washington was one fierce army dude, even if he didn't have hippo teeth. He power-slammed the entire British army, sometimes called torties, straight into the Atlantic Ocean. He was helped by some Massachusetts Minute Maids. "I believe you mean Minute Men," said Mr. Jupiter. "In one famous battle, George Washington crossed the Delaware River." Lenny went on. "Why did he cross the river?" asked Bruce. "To get to the other side," answered Lenny. "Actually," began Mr. Jupiter, "the Battle of Trenton was important because—" Lenny cut him off. "And you want to hear the weirdest part?" Heads around the room nodded eagerly. "Birds, lots and lots of them, took part in the Revolution." "What?" exclaimed Mr. Jupiter. "It's true," said Lenny. "I read it on Chikipedia." Mr. Jupiter waved his hands. "No, no, no," he cried. "That is completely untrue. How many times have I told you not to trust online sources? Believe me, birds took no part in the Revolution." "What about Patrick Henry, John Jay, Benjamin Franklin?" said Lenny. Mr. Jupiter looked at him, bewildered. "So then what happened?" asked Calvin. "The Patriots, that's us, trounced the Redcoats, that's them, in a close war. The Patriots almost lost a couple times, but after a last-minute surge, they beat the Redcoats. The final score was 89 battles to 87 battles." The fifth graders whooped triumphantly. Ashley A. and Ashley B. leaped to their feet. "Ready?" cheered Ashley A. "Okay," cheered Ashley B. And then stomping and clapping, they cried, "Don't you know? Can't you guess? Patriots are the very best. Go back, Redcoats, go back home, and leave our USA alone. Go Patriots!" I'm thrilled by your enthusiasm, Mr. Jupiter shouted above the cheering, but I'd like to redirect the lesson. Shh.
Mommy,
Shh. You have to be quiet. Lenny cut him off again. Let me teach you a song I learned last night. He told the others. It's from the Revolution. Minutes later, the students and guinea pigs were singing, I'm a stinky poodle, Randy. Stinky poodle, do or die. Stinky poodle went to town just to find a hydrant. Mr. Jupiter shrugged. They may not have the full scope of history yet, he said to himself. But it's a start. Yes, it's definitely a start. The moral of this lesson is, little by little does the trick. Think about what you think that might mean. Little by little does the trick. Sorry about Bella in the background.